welcome to Your Choice 2020 General Election coverage on HOMTV. I'm Janelle James, and joining us for the candidate interview is Joe Hartman, Libertarian Congressional Candidate for the 8th District. Thank you so much for joining us today. At this time, we would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to our viewers.
My name's Joe Hartman, and I'm on the ballot for Congress this year. I've been a part of the Libertarian Party, and I've been a Libertarian for many years. And I took the opportunity to put my name out there as a third-party candidate to offer an alternative to the Republican and Democrat options for people who want to look into, voting for a third-party candidate as a protest vote, or as, really just to get my ideas out there and spread the message of liberty and the value of individual liberty, and try to inject a different approach to, public policy and political discourse.
Thank you. Each 8th District Congressional candidate will be asked a standard list of 11 questions. Let's get started with question number 1. Explain how your education and professional background make you an ideal candidate for this position.
My professional background is mostly in tax accounting. And so I've helped hundreds or thousands of taxpayers over the years sort out how to deal with the stress and the challenges of the tax code. And so I have a sort of deep understanding of how destructive the tax collection can be in people's ability to advance, to save money, and also the many carve-outs and loopholes available to people who plan and are able to implement certain strategies. So that's one small part of my my occupation or background. And for my education, I went to public schools. I'm from South Florida. I moved to Michigan just a couple years ago, and I think of my education as much more about the types of reading and podcasts that I've listened to, and seeking out the ideas of people and the way that they perceive the role of the political system and the way that we should function as a society. And so the libertarian philosophy that I hold so dearly, and that I attempt to share in a somewhat persuasive way, is based in the idea that people should be free to make their own choices, and that government is often a barrier and an obstacle and a force of oppression in people's lives. And so the goal of my campaign is to try to share like I said, a different option of where government imposes its will on people, rather than people being able to pursue their own interests.
Question number 2. What do you believe are the greatest needs in the community, and what are your ideas to meet those needs, especially with uncertainties due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that it's been an example of how government has exerted its control over people, treated people as though they're incapable and incompetent to be safe, to make their own decisions. The heavy-handed lockdown that forced so many people out of business, forced so many people to be unable to work, is an example of the losing the free society that we should try to be pursuing. I think, from my perspective, the challenges in the community, the challenges in our society, are generally the result of government imposition and expansive law enforcement. And so all of my arguments, whether about more kind of broad policy views or more narrow, like specific issues, the idea is to get the government out of the way and let people interact with each other voluntarily, to have people have more options. And so, yeah, that's the basic premise. And I think in terms of the challenges with COVID-19, that much of the government response has exacerbated the problem, has made it extensively more destructive and caused more damage, rather than kind of I think one of the big examples of that, which is constantly a problem, is the heavy partisan nature of the reaction. I think, one side has tried to promote some fear and make it seem, extra scary to sort of justify their expansive lockdowns, and the other side tries to play down the virus at times. And I think both of it is inaccurate, and it's certainly we see a lot of the bad faith rhetoric that's so unfortunate and really sows discord among our society, and it perpetuates itself. Both teams are engaging in bad faith rhetoric and petty, partisan ways. And so, it makes it the idea of believing the science is not really a scientific phrase. Science is a constantly evolving and a constant pursuit of truth. And I think the government is in its stagnation and its arbitrary focus on throwing money at problems and claiming victory, that we see the problems that are caused specifically with COVID. And so, yeah, I think the best solution is to decentralize power, to have local governments have more control over or the ordinances in their areas, and in the state, but least of all the federal level. And since I'm on the ballot for U.S. Congress, I think the U.S. Congress should have very little to do with the way that we function in the 8th District of Michigan in our COVID response.
Question number 3. In light of recent events surrounding police brutality and demonstrations across the country, what is your stance on police reform in the state of Michigan?
Yeah, I think police reform is drastically needed and long overdue. The Libertarian Party has long been a force for decriminalization of drugs, for advocating for people to have freedom rather than the militarization of police that has had bipartisan support over the years. I think some of the police reform ideas I'm skeptical of. I think the idea of re-educating the police officers without changing the laws is something that I have a hard time seeing how that would be so effective. But I do think that drastically changing the role of how law enforcement imposes its will on people is something that I'm encouraged by much of the rhetoric. I think that the recent atrocities that have been committed by cops on people are somewhat they reflect a systemic problem that is not based in just the isolated incidents that generate lots of media attention, but are constantly going on throughout society in ways that we don't notice as closely. And so I think to focus on the police reform part of it, I support abolishing all drug laws. I think the idea of bodily autonomy and self-ownership is the idea that people are capable of making their own decisions, and that by the government attempts to prohibit substances, that this just leads to more conflict in our society. And so I think in so many situations where there are police killings or no-knock raids, that these are predicated on the idea that cops should try to stop people from taking substances. And so the opposition to victimless crime enforcement, if there is no victim, the cops should not be out messing with people. So I think that there have been, especially the demilitarization of police, I think that's a big part of it as well. I think this is a later question, but with gun control laws, a lot of times the police enforcement of gun control laws creates additional conflict in society, and puts someone in a situation where they're not hurting anyone else. They simply have their own resources, and yet because of the arbitrary laws imposed by the government, they become the victim of law enforcement aggression. And so I think there's a drastic need for change. I think there's a lot of movement in the right direction. The idea of defund the police, some of the rhetoric around that, I'm a little bit skeptical that it's kind of too broadly applied to other property owners and other businesses. But I think that really trying to focus the idea on the fact that the police are doing things that they're not capable of doing. One thing that America generally recognizes is that alcohol prohibition was an insane policy, and it was, at the time it had broad popular support. People were scared of alcohol in the same way that they're scared of certain drugs now. Um, but the idea that people can be responsible for their own actions and are capable, and they're not, pathetic and in need of a nanny state to, micromanage their lives and insert violence and chaos through the attempted enforcement of these prohibitions, something that is long overdue. And I think there's, some positive movement in the right direction. And I hope to support the best arguments for massive police reform.
Question number 4. Please comment on how you believe the state of Michigan should approach new or continued diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
I think that there's a need to treat people right. And I grew up in South Florida. I went to a mostly Black school, and so I've always been around people I grew up with in a diverse community. And I think of that as a major privilege, where I think that some of the rhetoric sometimes is very condescending, and it has this, there's a concept where diversity is this challenge to pursue, when it's really the default. If you just treat people and get to know your neighbors, you realize how much diversity there is around you. People have diversity of ideas and opinions and principles and religions and all sorts of ways where recognizing the individualist approach to being kind and empathetic is crucial. I also think that there's a trend towards some troubling ideas that violate the principles of Martin Luther King. The idea that we judge someone by the content of their character and not the color of their skin is something I strongly agree with. And I think that there's a bit of a backlash against that sometimes, where the discussion of race, I think in many ways has gotten worse in recent years. Some of the anti-racist rhetoric is very strange and just aggressive and dogmatic in ways that I'm not sure how widespread it is. There's certain aspects on social media that seem awfully troubling. One person that I have just a ton of admiration for his work is Coleman Hughes. He's a writer, a young guy in New York City who's been writing for a couple years on the topic, and he just has an excellent way of breaking down and explaining his argument and his approach. And then just as a kind of a random side story, I think what anti-racism should be is the story of Daryl Davis. And he has gotten national attention a few times, but this has nothing to do with Michigan. But Daryl Davis was a jazz musician, Black guy, I think in his 60s now. And for the last 30 years, or I guess to start, he grew up, traveling around the world on military bases in the US. And he, was surprised when he learned of racism in the US when he moved back here. And, he thought, how do these people, judge me when they don't even know me? Or why do they hate me when they don't even know me? And I think, so his approach was to go out and meet KKK members and talk to them and just be friendly and share his talent of making music. And so he's collected dozens of KKK robes, which I don't know if you'd really want to keep those, but he did as his souvenir for the people that, were filled with hate. And through his, friendship and just, open discussion and empathy, he cured them of their ignorance. And I think that that's just a beautiful story that I think is a great example of what diversity and inclusion should look like, rather than some of the just more pernicious approaches that are sometimes included in those words.
Question number 5. What are your thoughts on how Michigan can address major topics of concern, including but not limited to human trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence, the opioid epidemic, and gun violence?
Yeah, those are a lot of topics. And I think, I guess to start with the human trafficking and that part of it, I don't know how relevant this is to the overall issue, but just to make the argument that I support the decriminalization of prostitution. That's another example of bodily autonomy, where the government attempts to prohibit that consensual voluntary activity leads to conflict and violence. Um, in terms of the broader human trafficking concerns, I think there's some, there are terrible stories. It's a global problem as well. So I think that definitely in terms of the role of the federal government, that's something where the government should be involved in protecting people and their property or their bodies from violent assault. And so when it comes to gun control, I strongly, or I guess the question was gun violence. And I think there's a lot of times where gun violence, stems from the expansive role of law enforcement. There are so many situations where people have weapons, but they do not have, the particular, they haven't paid for the licensing, or they have, some other issue that prevents them from having, they have their rights taken away. And so, just in the attempts at gun control tend to lead to more violence. And one of the other questions was the opioid epidemic. And I think, that goes back to the drug war and the problems that come with, people getting started with terrible substances. And, a lot of times it starts with a prescription, and then they go into getting street drugs. And the fact that these drugs are illegal leads to the problems of, they continue to have demand for their substances, but they're not able to get supply from an open market where there's a regulatory reaction to the providers who offer bad substances. And so instead, a lot of times overdoses are connected to getting drugs that have been messed with and or are different strengths than people are used to. And so with so many of these issues, I think as one additional note with that, there have been somewhat of a spike in opioid overdoses and suicides from the COVID response, or from the COVID situation, where people are less available to live their lives and have social interaction. And we need that. And so I think just overall trying to build a more peaceful and a more free society is the goal. And in so many ways, reducing the power of the regulatory system and law enforcement is at the center of my message in my attempt to offer solutions to those problems, or at least ways to minimize those problems, or move in the right direction. Is that a lot of times the goal should be to reduce the power of the political system over the individuals and our opportunities.
Question number 6. What do you believe are some of the pros and cons of the current healthcare system? If elected, how would you address healthcare?
I think I strongly support the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. I am optimistic that the Supreme Court case that's getting a lot of attention, that they will vote to repeal, or that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. I think it's unfortunate that so much of the narrative has been around the pre-existing condition coverage. That's something where that's one small part of the Affordable Care Act. And the bipartisan rhetoric has been that any new bill would include pre-existing condition coverage. And so my approach is that the Affordable Care Act has many problems. That one of the best things, in terms of, you asked a question about what are the good things. The United States has massive amounts of highly skilled doctors and highly skilled researchers making incredible advancements in the healthcare system. And I think one of the good things about the Affordable Care Act was that it created a marketplace where people could purchase health insurance from insurance providers and have the government kind of facilitate that process. But the problem is that in that process, the Affordable Care Act prohibited many types of policies that would be more flexible and more customized to meet people's needs. So instead, there's the heavy-handed, one-size-fits-all regulations that impose, mandatory. They call it minimum essential coverage, which is it's not minimum. There's an expansive amount of policy of services that are included, whether you want them or not. And so the inability of the market to adapt to consumer needs is the key. That's the fundamental aspect of the Affordable Care Act and why costs are so high. And I think one of the other things that people don't really understand is how the Affordable Care Act subsidies work. So for people who purchase the policies in the marketplace, through the Affordable Care Act marketplace, the subsidy is completely fixated on taxable income as according to your tax returns. And with the recent story about President Trump and his, big write-offs and lowering his income substantially with real estate, as a real estate investor, that this is something where, there are, wealthy landlords who are able to retire early, before they're 65 and on Medicare. And they receive, very, very almost free health insurance, getting $1,000 a month subsidies from the federal government, while middle income people, younger people, pay much more, especially people in higher cost cities where they have very little discretionary income, but the federal government fixates the qualification of subsidy on their income for tax purposes. And so I think it's an atrocious system. I think overall there are some good parts without any doubt, and there was definitely some people who were helped. But I think that like I said, the one size fits all nature of the policy is really troubling and something that I hope we can move on from. And I think that whatever comes next would definitely be better. That the government will be able to learn from the result. And I guess I shouldn't say that but I do think that there's an opportunity for a more adaptable, more responsive system to replace the Affordable Care Act.
Question number 7. Please comment on Michigan's infrastructure.
Well, there are roads, and there have been lots of discussion about how the roads are a problem. I think one of the terrible tragedies of the last 20 years was what happened in Flint, and obviously that's a part of infrastructure. And I think there's been a lot of blame shifting and kind of obscuring the story. But one of the things that's not really realized is that in Flint there was a large increase in payouts and salaries and benefits paid to public sector union, paid to the cops and firefighters. There was a big increase in the quote public safety payroll spending in the boom years from 2003 through 2006 and 7. And during that time, Flint didn't. They after the crash and after the financial crisis, Flint was in dire straits financially, and that was what forced them into changing their water system. And so that I think a lot of times with the problems with infrastructure, we can point to the nature of government policy not being responsive and causing problems because the politicians allocating resources are not incentivized to look to the future. They call it investing, but it's always just spending. And the idea that the politicians controlling the resources are incentivized to focus on the short-term outcomes, to be able to throw money at problems and claim victory, rather than actually investing and actually looking at the long-term dynamics of the choices that they're making. And so I think with other infrastructure questions, and my approach, the federal government shouldn't have much to do with that at all. And that's something Michigan taxpayers and Michigan state legislature can focus on. And in so many ways, the infrastructure spending goes to special interests. There are certain areas that have better roads than others. And yeah, so that's my approach to Michigan's infrastructure.
Question number 8. Could you also comment on the quality of Michigan schools?
I think there are many great schools in Michigan. One thing, this kind of goes with what I said on the last point, is that the current education payroll spending, that today's teachers and students only get 67% of the money that is currently spent in the budget for education payroll. The other third, the other 33%, goes to pay pension debt, to go to fill the unfunded liability of the pension system. And so I think it's another example of where the politicians of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the choices that they made and the promises that they made to the union retirees, that those are examples of how the people of today, today's teachers and students are, getting less of what's available because of the irresponsibility of the political system. And I think that it's very costly. And I think that in some ways schools are underfunded. In other ways, that the resources are allocated, in this sort of special interest ways, where there's curriculum, so much spending to certain corporations who develop curriculum. And one of the other things that I advocate for is education choice. I think that having families being able to, if they choose to try to go to a different school, or to homeschool, that they would be able to take a portion of the public funds allocated to their child, and instead of going to a public school, or to a government-run school, they could go to a charter school or to homeschool resources, and that just speaks to the flexibility. I think many people would choose to stay in their public schools, and there are many excellent public schools around the state. And I think that just that dynamic is something that benefits everyone. That it's something that empowers families and empowers communities to develop more adaptive, and more flexible education systems that really meet the needs of the students for today and the future. There's a lot of stagnation in the education system because it's run by government, and there are interests that restrain it from adapting to having more information. I think it's unfortunate how much memorization is still a part of school rather than the more seeking out truth. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think that the education system could play a role in trying to teach children and students to be skeptical, to question the narratives that they perceive, and to always pursue truth. I think that's the goal of education, is to be able to figure out what's true and what's not, rather than having the more spoon-fed kind of top-down approach that is unfortunately a part of so many public school systems.
With a few minutes remaining, we would like to give you this time to make a closing statement.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show today. I hope I made some sense to people. I'd be grateful for anyone, if you have any questions or want to talk to me. My campaign phone number is 248-382-8448. I wanted to be a part of the political world for this past few months, just to try to make some noise and share my approach to individual liberty, to empowering people to make their own decisions, and to try to frame the narrative around the role of government, around the question that, or around the premise that government should play a much smaller role in our society than it currently does, that it imposes its will on us through heavy-handed law enforcement and regulation, and that Democrats and Republicans are just engaged in a perceived tug of war that's really just slightly it's very petty, and it's very partisan in ways that perpetuate itself. Unfortunately, I wasn't included in the debates with my opponents, but that's how it goes. I get it. But I think that it's important to have as many views out there. And anyway, I'd be grateful to hear from any potential voters. I hope you consider voting for me, or as a protest if you're not happy with your party's candidate, or if you just want to vote for someone who's definitely not going to win, just to make sure you don't feel guilty if the people in office do engage in legislature that harms people. So that's my pitch.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for watching this candidate interview with Joe Hartman, Libertarian Congressional Candidate for the 8th District. I'm Janelle James, inviting you to watch live General Election Night coverage on Tuesday, November 3rd, right here on HOMTV. Thanks for watching.